Good afternoon. It's great to be sitting here with Wayne Marriott this afternoon, who's been assisting us with the Cultural Precinct Project with Taupo District Council. And Wayne brings a lot of experience around museums throughout, both nationally and throughout internationally. And really delighted to have you with us here today. I wonder if you could just give us a bit of background on what you've been doing in the museum space.
Look, I've hung around museums for a very, very long time, since I was about 16, which is more than 1 or 2 decades ago. I've worked in the smaller institutions like this. I started out my professional career down in the Southland Museum and Art Gallery, working under the fantastic Russell Beck, who was New Zealand's jade specialist. So he kicked us all into touch, and from there headed off to Museums Aotearoa, which was the national body of museums. And from there headed to Nelson, where I was responsible for the redevelopment of the Nelson Provincial Museum. It's called the new TA 445 site. Throughout my career, I've been in places like Nelson, Hawera, in the Middle East, in Qatar, also in Whakatane, where I did several projects for both the council, but also assisted in the development of some other buildings there, which are cultural-based facilities.
You've identified some of the below potential, some of the difficulties we're struggling with in our current museum. I wonder if you could just expand on those a little bit.
Well, your museum is a really good example of one of those museums that were pulled together by a group of enthusiastic people a number of decades ago, who said, look, we've got to try and preserve some of our history for future generations. So it's normally a group of local enthusiasts who come together. From that really small base, from that beginning, there's now been this growing desire, and you can see it within the wider community you have here, of preserving the stories from one generation so that they can continue to inspire or continue to grow in future generations. For a small museum like this, there are some challenges. Firstly, its location. Secondly, the nature of the building. So there's several buildings that have been cobbled together over the years. The building is a wooden building, so that does have its challenges in terms of long-term preservation for the objects within the building. It's not ideally suited to air conditioning, and at the moment there's only one gallery that is air conditioned. It's about entranceways, it's about bringing all of those stories together and actually rethinking how you can tell the stories. And if you think about the history of this area, it starts off geographically, then you have geological stories. You've got this amazing story of the eruption, obviously, of the mountain, hence the lake. Then you have the arrival of man within this. So there's layer upon layer of history. And all of those stories have an opportunity to be told within the new facility. By thinking outside the square, and by putting both the museum and the library and also the civic administration building together, what you're doing is creating a very visible public front in terms of the library and the museum, and also the functions of the council can remain on site but actually hidden within that process. So it's a good way to maximise the use of space, a good way to maximise opportunities for the community, but also to get the whole of council engaged within its own history, within its own heritage, to realise that they're there as responsible guardians alongside the rest of the community to protect and preserve for the future generations. So by working in the way that you're doing at the moment, by bringing in the consultants and having those conversations with the community, with tangata whenua, is going to mean that there's a very sound foundation upon which this project is built.
I understand from conversations and since I've been involved in the project that there's probably quite a lot of artefacts and precious tonga that are sitting around in other facilities that we just can't bring here at the moment, and potentially those types of things are missing from our community. Is there a couple of examples of things that you could imagine we might be able to bring home?
Well, there are some really good examples of po in particular. Those po are now in places like the Auckland Museum. They're also in Te Papa as two very good examples of places who actually hold a lot of material, a lot of tonga that actually relates to the Taupo area. So that's been collected effectively since the 1840s. Some pieces maybe even earlier, but we know, for example, in the early 1840s, Diefenbach was through here. He had with him Joseph Jenner Merritt, who undertook a number of sketches on that tour. The originals of those sketches have recently been rediscovered. They were in Trieste, they're now in Cologne. A copy was brought out here last year, and there's been a lot of work being done between Te Wharetoa historians, the Alexander Turnbull Library, but this institution hasn't been part of that conversation, and it should be, because it's actually a very valid place in which those stories can be told. There's some wonderful photographic collections. There's good paintings. You see paintings coming up all the time which relate to this area, to the lake, and to the stories of the region. So that material is often found in bigger institutions. Good examples would be Auckland and Taupo, for example. Now, we know that they don't exhibit everything, and that's just a reality of the nature of the collections and the size of the institutions. But there's been a lot of rethinking in museums over the last decade, which is now providing the opportunities for taonga and other material and artefacts that it may be post-European settlement within an area to actually come back to the area in which it once was. If your institution meets certain standards and criteria. At the moment, this institution doesn't. So there's no air conditioning system, there is a fire risk, there's also a pest risk. You're very, very close to the lake and to the river. So you've got to be doubly sure about, the little four-legged furry friends and all the other things that run around. So you've just got to make sure that you're providing the best possible environment in which another institution who's looked after that material, in some cases for up to 150 plus years, to actually say, we can send that material back to you and we know that you are a good keeper and a good guardian. The best part of that material coming back is what I call the 2.5-inch syndrome. That means your local community, your young kids within the community can start to have access to that. So, for example, Te Wharetoa, they're here. They live in this area. Why should they always have to travel to Wellington or Auckland or Dunedin, Christchurch to look at their own taonga? If that material is here, then you have elders within the community, the kaumātua, who can actually instruct and teach the next generation about the history, about the carving. And guess what happens? Those kids walk out of that room 2.5 inches taller because they've suddenly got an identity, they've suddenly got a connection with material that once upon a time was often another institution, so they can be really proud. That same level of 2.5-inch syndrome then filters its way through the community because the community then take on ownership of their institution. They stand tall and proud of their history because places like this community is one of the great tourist meccas of New Zealand. We know that tourists love coming here. But don't turn it just into a tourism institution, turn it into the place where the community says you must go and visit our museum, you must go and hang out at our library, because we are providing something and telling a story which is completely unique. And at the moment, this redevelopment in terms of its time frame is probably going to be the closest institution, because we've got other museums around here that are closed for earthquake repairs for the foreseeable future. There isn't a museum up there in Tauranga. There is an art gallery. There's one obviously in Whakatane and in Portuguese in Kawerau, but this would be the site. This is the operating museum at the moment. So there's some wonderful stories that can be told, and a way also to generate more people coming into the community to share those stories, and then from there they leave this community and they say, guess what we saw? There's something amazing, and that becomes not only good for domestic tourism, but good for international tourism, and adds another string to the bow. I think we often talk about the tourists as being a catalyst, and I think economically we have to say they are a catalyst. But at the end of the day, if your museum doesn't inspire your local community, then what's it there for? So one of the challenges will be, for a project as big as this, is going to be funding. And so there are models that are around. Those models are often known as the third. So you say to your local community, we need to find 1/3 of the funding from our local community, which is a mixture of ratepayers and some philanthropists. Then you have your second third. Well, your second third is your next ratcheted level philanthropy. So it can be your community trusts, it may be energy trusts, it may be companies that are associated with the area. That's the key level of funding. That also can include lotto. So for all those people who buy lotto tickets and miss out on whichever prize pool it is, we say thank you, because their money will potentially help this project. Your losings will actually become our winnings in terms of being able to access New Zealand Lottery Grants Board money for that. The other third that really has to have that big conversation is central government in terms of a number of funds. So there is the Regional Museums Fund, which was designed really for museums that are going to have a major impact, that are going to contribute to the national identity, to have a significant contribution from central government. There's also the Provincial Growth Fund, and everybody talks about it. It's a bit like Santa Claus's sack at the moment. You don't quite know what's in the sack, but there is, through the Provincial Growth Fund, I think a very good case that could be put forward for what this institution could achieve. Not only the museum, the library, but also the civic building, the whole facility could actually achieve, not only for this community, this region, but also contribute nationally as part of that conversation. And likewise, there are also, as part of that, there are some international funds that if your community deserves that money, there will be some international funds that will make funding available to your institution. So there's some very good, true, tried and tested models out there. There are some very good examples where that's worked well. Pukeariki, for example, in New Plymouth was a very good example of the old third. There's a bit of wavering in each part of the third, but effectively you saw the community, central government and the corporate philanthropic sector coming together to create that amazing institution.
It's been really neat having you here with us today, Wayne, and I really appreciate the time that you've taken to sit down with me and just explain through some of the options that we have and the opportunities as we start from scratch on this project. And it's neat to have you on board with us. Your experience and your clear passion for the project is really welcome. So thank you very much. We look forward to meeting again.